From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Joe Biden is making his first swing through the Middle East as president, visiting Israel first, then meeting with the Palestinians, on to Saudi Arabia for a meeting with Gulf Arab nations, and in particular Mohammed bin Salman, the controversial crown prince of Saudi, whom he once vowed to treat as a, quote, pariah. Well, pariah no more. What does the president hope to accomplish with this bout of realpolitik diplomacy? And what about the big country that he won't visit, but that looms very large on this trip, Iran? Welcome. I'm Paul Gigot with Joe Sternberg and Kim Strassel here on another edition of Potomac Watch. Thank you for joining us. This is a fascinating trip in many ways. Kim, let's start with Israel, which the president visited Wednesday and again Thursday. Interesting in a couple of ways. Obviously, the relationship between Israel and the United States, not as, I guess, as good as it had been under Donald Trump. On the other hand, I think much better than it was under Barack Obama, where there was so much tension between Obama and Benjamin Netanyahu, then the prime minister of Israel. And what strikes me as fascinating about this trip is that without anybody saying so, President Biden seems to be building on the Abraham Accords of Donald Trump's last year, which was about improving the relationships between the Gulf Arab states and Israel. And it's unspoken, but I think it's very real.
Actually, Paul, it was spoken. I was completely shocked. Politico had a story today in which they demanded a statement from the administration about how they felt about the Abraham Accords. And they actually said, we strongly support the Abraham Accords and normalization agreements between Israel and countries in the Arab and Muslim worlds. And of course, those Abraham Accords, which were forged under the Trump administration, normalized relations with Bahrain, the United Arab Emirates, and Morocco. And it was a huge breakthrough because up until that point, everything had flowed around this discussion of a Palestinian state, a two-state solution. The merit of those accords is that they decoupled the notion of Israel's interaction and place in the Middle East from that and allowed it to move ahead on economic and some military cooperation, normalization there. And this, as you said, has, I think, taken a lot of the tension out of a trip like this. It's allowed the president to come and talk more about how you can strengthen that. They have pretty much decided not to put a lot of focus on a two-state solution. A lot of Democratic presidencies have tried to push that rock up a hill and got nowhere. So they've clearly just decided to put that to the side. And instead, this seems to be about reaffirming our relationship with Israel. There was a little celebration or honor of the Iron Dome system that we have to help Israel defend against rocket attacks. There's been some talk about the Iranian nuclear deal, which might be the one area of tension. But overall, I think this has really put the president in a situation to mostly just highlight our relationship and not get sucked into a lot of very complex issues that often surround trips like this.
President Biden meeting with the Palestinian leaders on Thursday. We'll see what that brings, but I very much agree with you, Kim, that the preoccupation that had dominated American foreign policy with Israel for so long, which was the two-state solution, getting a Palestinian-Israel agreement, has really been put on the back burner. Remember, John Kerry, under the Secretary of State under President Obama, made this a priority. Never mind the fact that over many decades it has been very hard to come to any settlement. So I think it's a very good development. We'd all love to see peace between the Arabs and Israel, but until there are Palestinian leaders who are willing to put Hamas in a corner, the radical group, and recognize that Israel exists, it's just not going to happen. The Israeli public will not support it. The issue that does loom large in the background, which is a point of contention, Joe, is, however, between the U.S. and Israel, is Iran. And let's listen to clips from President Biden and then Prime Minister Yair Lapid of Israel on that point.
You and I also discussed America's commitment to ensuring Iran never obtains a nuclear weapon. This is a vital security interest to both Israel and the United States, and I would add, for the rest of the world as well. I continue to believe that diplomacy is the best way to achieve this outcome, and will continue to work with Israel to counter other threats from Iran throughout the region, including support for terrorism, ballistic missile program that continues, and the proliferation of weapons to terrorists and proxies like Hezbollah.
They want to destroy the only Jewish state in the world. We will never let that happen. Words will not stop them, Mr. President. Diplomacy will not stop them. The only thing that will stop Iran is knowing that if they continue to develop their nuclear program, the free world will use force. The only way to stop them is to put a credible military threat on the table.
Joe, the emphasis there is certainly notable. Israel thinks Iran simply can't be trusted, and even if there is an agreement, it will continue to pursue a bomb. But President Biden keeps looking for that elusive return to the Obama nuclear deal. Why won't he give up the dream?
Because it is a dream. I think it was a dream of the Obama administration. It's one that the Biden administration has inherited, and I think that probably happens because, this notion that you can solve a long-running problem like the Iranian regime and its nuclear ambitions through deft statecraft and diplomacy without really having to make any difficult decisions in terms of economic sanctions, let alone military force. That is the dream for a lot of foreign policy experts, especially on the political left, isn't it? And so I think that the notion that you could do a nuclear deal has always appealed to that kind of thinker about foreign policy. The problem, and what really comes through in the clips that we've just heard from that press conference, is that the Israelis don't have the luxury of looking at this as a diplomatic hobby project that you can do on the side and hope for the best. And this is an existential problem for Israel, the possibility that Iran could develop a nuclear weapon. I think that really explains the very marked difference in tone there for Israel. And I think that for a lot of countries in the Middle East, they don't have the luxury of hoping that diplomacy will solve the Iranian nuclear problem. They need an approach that actually will solve that problem. And I think that under the Trump administration, that ended up being an American withdrawal from that deal, plus a pressure campaign on the Iranian regime. But that is not something that the current administration is prepared to pursue now. And it really does seem to be making allies nervous, and it's probably going to create a lot of tense conversations for Biden on this trip.
Yeah, I'm sure that there were frank and candid exchanges behind closed doors about Iran between the president and various Israel officials. He also is meeting with the opposition leader Benjamin Netanyahu, former prime minister, maybe future prime minister, because Israel is in the middle of another election campaign as the latest government post-Netanyahu government has collapsed, and they're going to try to have an election to form a new one. Of course, it's a very divided country, and they've had a hard time forming a new government. In Israeli politics, there is a consensus that is very hawkish when it comes to Iran and very hawkish generally on foreign policy, and that is a reality that the United States has had to deal with. Kim, the administration came into office saying we want to do a deal with Iran. They have devoted a lot of time and energy to the talks in Europe with the French, the Germans, and the British, and the Russians as partners in this negotiation, but with very little to show for it. Iran continues to press its nuclear program, enriching uranium at ever greater amounts. And who knows what else they're doing. They have sparred with United Nations atomic energy inspectors, not letting them see certain sites and refusing to respond to certain questions about suspicious things that the inspectors have located. Do you see this continuing on the part of the administration, just trying to keep this going? Because, of course, the alternative would be they'd have to return to the Trump policy of maximum pressure to try to see if they could put pressure on Iran to come back to the table.
I see them continuing this as long as they can continue it. The question is whether or not it doesn't simply hit a dead end because of other parties to the negotiation. One of them obviously being Iran, which, as you said, is pushing every boundary at the moment, which seems to show no inclination itself to really want to get a deal. One of the things that also is a sticking point, though you have to ask the question if the reason Iran is demanding it so forcefully is because they know they are unlikely to get it, and this is a way of getting the United States off their back, but they continue to demand that the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps be taken off the list of terrorist organizations the U.S. maintains. They say that is an element that they need to go ahead with any deal. The Biden administration, in part to reassure the Israelis, which had made a big issue out of this, did try to reassure them and said that was not going to happen, that the president said that while he was on this trip. The other, of course, big player and focus here is that one of the parties to these talks is Russia. And obviously, relations are not good at the moment, given the Ukrainian war. And they also seem to be throwing a spanner into this works, making this more difficult. So, yeah, I see the administration pushing, but in the end, especially given the Biden administration doesn't have the best foreign policy track record so far, they're going to have to make a decision about whether or not they continue to invest real time and credibility in this effort, or whether or not they cut their losses and, more actively engage with Israel and other players to instead attempt to disrupt the Iranian program by other means.
All right, Kim and Joe, we're going to take a break. And when we come back, we'll talk about the president and Saudi Arabia, which he heads to on Friday for meetings. And also Russia and Iran, new closeness there when we come back.
From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Welcome back. I'm Paul Gigot with Joe Sternberg and Kim Strassel. And President Biden continues his Middle East sojourn with a visit to Saudi Arabia, where he will meet with the leaders of several nations at a group session in the Middle East, most of them U.S. allies, certainly friends in some way. The big meeting that everybody's waiting for, though, is the one-on-one with MBS, Mohammed bin Salman, the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, the young, aggressive Crown Prince who the CIA has implicated in the murder of the journalist Khashoggi. A couple of years ago, the president, while campaigning, said he would make MBS a pariah. He came into office and killed arms sales to the Saudis, withdrawing support for the war in Yemen, and then trying to reinvigorate the Iranian nuclear deal, which the Saudis very much dislike, as they live in that same rough neighborhood. They don't want the Shiite Persians to get a nuclear weapon that they think could help them dominate the region. So the president now, though, going to Saudi Arabia for what I think will be a photo opportunity with MBS. I don't think there's much chance he can duck that, although they say he's going to duck a joint press conference, which I think if you're the White House, you can see why they're doing that, Joe. Why take the risk of this kind of criticism at home for meeting with MBS?
Oil. I really do think that a lot of this, if not all of it, has to do with energy policy, because we find ourselves in a situation where energy prices have been rising pretty steadily for a variety of reasons, one of which has to do with various supply disruptions to do with the Russian war in Ukraine. And Saudi Arabia produces a lot of oil. And so I think that historically the pattern has been that whenever you have this kind of stress in the energy markets, the U.S. and allies find themselves having a new kind of conversation with Saudi Arabia and other oil-producing regimes in the Middle East. Now, what's crazy about the situation, especially if you're Joe Biden and have made the kind of statements about the Saudi Arabian regime that candidate Biden did back in 2020, is that going hand in hand to the Middle East could be avoidable if the U.S. were producing more domestic energy itself. But I think that this visit, in a broad sense, is evidence that the administration has not internalized this message, that sort of taking that strong rhetorical stand on human rights issues or, the free press or any of the rest of it, as important as those things are. If you are a U.S. president, that is a luxury that you have to buy, and you have to buy it with domestic energy production in the U.S. And since that, for other political reasons, has been a cost that Joe Biden is not prepared to pay, the alternative that he faces is that he has to go, make a bit of a climb down by flying to that part of the world and doing this kind of meeting.
Let's listen to President Biden himself talk about Mr. Khashoggi and Saudi Arabia, and then talk about the reasons he's actually going there.
I'm going to be meeting with 9 other heads of state. It's not just it happens to be in Saudi Arabia. And so there are so many issues at stake that I want to make clear that we can continue to lead in the region and not create a vacuum that is filled by China and or Russia against the interest of both Israel and the United States and many other countries. I always bring up human rights. But my position on Khashoggi has been so clear. If anyone doesn't understand it in Saudi Arabia or anywhere else, then they haven't been around for a while.
Kim, interesting. President, of course, taking some real hits here at home, heavy criticism from the left and other Democrats for his coming handshake with Saudi Arabia. I guess the question is, you agree with Joe that this is largely about real politics? And if you do, I mean, my own view is we have to have a working relationship with the Gulf Arabs, and particularly Saudi Arabia. We simply do. The world looks a lot worse for us if we don't have that relationship. The Saudis have reacted to the United States of the last decade, particularly the Obama administration and the Biden administration's pursuit of an Iranian deal, by diversifying their friends. They're now selling oil to the Chinese. They're dealing with the Chinese. They're trying to improve their relationship with Putin and Russia, and they have options. So we have to have some relationship with them. It's often uncomfortable. The Khashoggi murder was outrageous and ugly. But if you're speaking of ugly, I mean, Vladimir Putin. And we have to, deal with him. The president now, because of the war, not going to have a meeting with him, but he did meet with him. So this is the kind of thing the American president has to do, whether or not he's trying to pump more oil.
Yeah, it's absolutely vital. It's unpleasant. It's distasteful, but it's also the real world, as you said. And, Joe mentioned the oil question. There are real U.S. security interests. You mentioned China and Russia. The other looming question here, obviously, is Iran. Why do we have the Abraham Accords that we've made already? Why did those happen in the Middle East? It's because it became increasingly obvious to many of those Gulf states and other players that the big threat, a growing, looming threat, was Iran in the region, and the need to ally with Israel, make common cause in that regard, was one of the things that drove those accords. Similarly, I think you could look at this trip and see this a little bit as the president almost kind of a fallback situation in case Iran, that deal blows up, to make sure that he has maintained his relationships with these other big players like Saudi Arabia, and make sure that everyone has a plan in place to contain Iran as we go forward. One little interesting thing that came out, the Israelis just last month, for instance, announced a Middle East air defense project. They didn't name their partners in it, but it's a project that recognizes the growing threat from Iranian drones that have been wandering in and blowing up different oil facilities in Saudi territory. So this is a new program that allows the Israelis and other Middle Eastern groups to coordinate when they see those drones. It's all funneled through U.S. Central Command and then do something about it. These are the kinds of things that are important for U.S. security interests. So I appreciate the president doesn't necessarily want to now have to step into his whole pariah state problem that he created for himself by kind of coming out of the gate very strong there. But it was always going to be clear that the U.S. was going to have to maintain some sort of relationship with Saudis and others.
Yeah, Joe, all the more so here, I think, because we've seen the expanding ties between Russia and Iran. The story this week coming out of the U.S., the Biden administration saying that Iran is now going to deliver hundreds of armed drones to Russia that it could use against Ukraine in its war. Vladimir Putin planning to visit Tehran next week in a three-part summit with Turkey, ostensibly to discuss Syria, where all three have major presences and interests. But on the side, this is really also going to be about the Russian-Iranian partnership that is getting closer, and that has implications for the United States. And I guess the one big question I have for the administration is why, given all that, why in the world would the United States want to continue making Russia a partner in the Iranian negotiations?
Yes, this is something that I always find so puzzling about a lot of these foreign policy discussions, because it's sort of, people sit in their think tanks or their administration offices in Washington and they label this country a rogue regime and that country an international pariah and the third country a threat to international stability. And then they're surprised that these countries kind of get together on the basis that not all what we have in common is that we are not America's friends. So, I mean, we shouldn't at all be surprised that regimes like the Iranians and the Russians would be looking for ways that they could cooperate more, or that the Chinese would be interested in expanding their footprint in the Middle East, or that the Saudis might be interested in cooperating with the Chinese if they feel like they're being ostracized by Washington. So, I mean, if you want to talk about Biden reconciling himself with a greater sense of realpolitik by making this visit to the Middle East in the first place, I mean, a big part of that is also going to have to be understanding that regimes that are unfriendly to the U.S. are not going to continue being unfriendly to us alone. They might start trying to cooperate with each other every once in a while. And it would be nice if we could have a foreign policy out of Washington that would more consistently account for how you can cultivate relations with potential allies to deal with that reality.
All right. Thank you, Kim. Thank you, Joe. Thank you all for listening. You can catch us on Potomac Watch every day now. And please be sure to send us your reactions or questions to pwpodcast@wsj.com. We'll be back tomorrow with another edition of Potomac Watch.